1653 shows up in Lanark records with a threat to put a woman in the branks and banish her if she scolded again. That's paperwork, not folklore. You might expect dungeons, but stop right there. The weapon was the crowd watching you. What happens when shame follows you for years, not hours? Bet you'll guess the loudest device is the worst. Then the quietest wins. We're breaking down 20 devices together. Let's start with number 20. Vaginal pair. Modern historians often label the so-called vaginal pair a disputed device because clear court records for vaginal use are almost impossible to locate. Museums still describe a metal fruit that opens like an umbrella. If you care about truth, that missing paperwork is the first red flag in many displays. Some pear-shaped objects in early modern collections appear as mouth gags, and some resemble fruit presses, which Wikipedia notes when purpose stays unclear. Fear sells fast, so a label can drift from tool to sex torture over decades. Ask who first cataloged it, and when and what sources they cited. A historian has warned that many famous torture gadgets were 19th-century fantasies built for tourists, assembled from older parts with dramatic stories attached. If that critique fits, pain becomes a product. It also hides the quieter truth. Systems controlled women through shame, fines, and courts, not props as often imagined. So here is your test, watching a museum case. Do you accept the scariest claim or demand documents? Source-checking matters because legends spread faster than minutes in an archive. Keep that mindset, since the next items look brutally specific. Which ones have proof and which ones sell panic today? Here comes number 19. Breast ripper. Torture museums across Europe display objects labeled breast rippers, iron claws with 4 hooked teeth, sometimes described as heated first. Court records for those exact pieces are rare, and many surviving examples come from private collections. That gap changes what you can claim with confidence right now. Some 20th century writers said they punished adultery or failed mothers, but hard legal documentation stays thin. Private provenance is the warning light, because without archives, dates and uses can shift in retellings. When a display card sounds certain, ask which trial file, which court, which year supports it. A bilingual guide called it an insidious instrument used primarily on women. That word primarily points to strategy. Hurt a body part linked to womanhood, and fear spreads to everyone watching. Medical studies on torture survivors link targeted injury with chronic pain, sleep problems, and long anxiety that can last decades. So even one story about this tool can function like a public threat, whether or not every museum claim is proven. Symbolic injury can control a whole group. Keep your eyes open for that pattern, because the next punishments often target something less visible than skin. What happens when power goes after your voice instead? Let's move to number 18. Scold's bridle. Scottish records date the scold's bridle to 1567, and local church courts used it on women labeled gossips or nags. It was an iron frame locked over the head with a plate inside the mouth, sometimes with a tongue spike. Who decided talk was dangerous? Wikipedia describes it as an instrument used on women whose speech was deemed troublesome. That means the offense could be loud disagreement, not violence. The plate forced the tongue down, turning normal speech into pain. Then the town watched, learning that a woman's anger could carry legal risk. One researcher on early modern shaming punishments wrote, "Humiliation was the essence of punishment, meant to terrify the whole town." That line explains the public design. The point was not only silence in one mouth, but silence spreading through everyone else. After one display, people self-police to avoid becoming the next example. So the bridle worked through witnesses more than wounds. Public humiliation was the engine. When you hear it was minor, ask what it did to reputation afterward in tight communities. Keep that thought, because some courts preferred harm that left few marks, yet wrecked bodies from the inside. How do you even prove that later? If you're still with me, tap like and subscribe, because the next few items flip the whole story, and you'll want the sources when it gets messy. Next one is number 17, strappado. Dictionary.com defines strappado as a victim raised with arms bound behind, then dropped and stopped with a painful jerk. Shoulders dislocate easily from that jerk, and the method can leave surprisingly little blood. Courts liked that contrast because it looks clean while causing huge damage under clothing. Modern forensic work on suspension torture warns reverse hanging can overstretch shoulder muscles so badly that kidney failure from muscle breakdown becomes a real risk. That detail changes the story because the body can crash later after the session ends. So an official can claim no injury, while the victim's organs tell a different story. In Europe, strappado appears in inquisitorial manuals and war engravings. Women accused of witchcraft, adultery, or heresy could be hoisted, then pressured to confess, with confession treated as proof. A medical review notes survivors often carry severe physical and psychological injuries for life, even when courts called it lawful procedure. So this was a system tool, not a random cruelty. Confession pressure drove it. If truth is produced by pain, the method rewards whoever can endure less. Keep that logic in mind, because some punishments were staged for crowds instead, using water, laughter, and repeated fear. What happens when the audience becomes part of the punishment? Let's move to number 16, ducking stool. Wikipedia explains ducking stools punished disorderly women and scolds, and although dishonest tradesmen appear in some accounts, many records frame it as a women's punishment. Some towns called it women pine, meaning women's pain, and offenses could be loud speech, rumors, sexual scandal, or a child outside marriage. Small accusations could escalate into official action fast. Cold, dirty water hits lungs and triggers panic, and repeated dunking raises drowning risk, even if the stated goal was shame. A historian wrote public penalties aimed to be terrifying and shameful enough to deter others. That quote explains why the crowd mattered. One dunk is scary, but repetition turns it into a show. The victim coughs, shivers, and still sits strapped in, learning how quickly a community can turn cruelty into entertainment. So the stool punished body and reputation together. Reputation damage keeps working after the water stops. When a town learns that public fear keeps order, it looks for devices that hurt even during stillness, turning furniture into weapons. If a seat can become a threat, what else in that world looks harmless until you sit down? Here comes number 15, witch's chair. Several European museums display spiked torture chairs with points on the seat, back, arms, and sometimes the footrest. Guides describe victims sitting nearly naked, so spikes press into skin with little blood at first. Pressure over time does the work, because the pain grows with every minute you remain trapped there. Some chairs are linked to early modern German towns and witch trials, though museum guides often admit exact trial records for each chair are thin. Even so, the design fits a wider system where confession under pain counts as legal truth. Move and spikes sink deeper. Stay still and muscles cramp. Then shaking forces new punctures anyway. One curator called such chairs theaters of obedience. That phrase matters because it shows the purpose. make the body perform submission in front of authority. The victim is trapped in a no-win loop, and the loop pushes words out. It becomes less about a single injury and more about controlling posture, breath, and time. So the chair teaches a grim lesson. Stillness hurts too. When a device makes every option painful, confession can feel like the only exit. Keep that in mind when you see famous monster devices, because some of the most famous stories may be built later for display. If a legend can be manufactured, what else might be? Let's move to number 14. Iron Maiden. Research suggests the famous Nuremberg Iron Maiden likely came together in the 18th to 19th centuries, assembled from older parts to thrill visitors. That date matters because it undercuts the medieval label many people assume. If the object is later, then many tales of routine medieval use lose their base. One scholar wrote there is no reliable medieval source showing real use of an Iron Maiden, and that many well-known examples were assembled in the 1800s for display. That means your fear response may be aimed at a staged artifact. Ask the boring question: what is the earliest written source describing the same cabinet you are shown? The Iron Maiden sells a simple monster, big, obvious, and cinematic. Big props can distract you from quieter tools that had clearer records, like shame devices used in towns. When you expect a giant coffin, a small head cage can look minor, even though it could control daily life with less spectacle and more frequency. So treat the Iron Maiden as a test of habits. Date checking protects you from myths that rewrite reality. When a display offers certainty without sources, that is a red flag. If a famous device might be built for tourists, what other classic torture stories might survive mainly because they sell fear better than proof? Next one is number 13. The Brank. Lanark town records from 1653 warn a woman that if she is found scolding or railing again, she will be set in the branks and banished. That is strong documentation. The brank is a form of scold's bridle, and surviving pieces often add masks, animal faces, mocking verses, and bells. Why add theater? Wikipedia says branking was designed as a mirror punishment for shrews or scolds by preventing them from speaking. The gag blocks speech, the mask invites laughter, and bells announce the victim before anyone even looks. That combination turns punishment into a moving sign. If you see it once, do you forget it or fear it? Historians of shaming penalties show these devices hit women hardest in small communities, where reputation shapes work, marriage, and safety. Reputation loss can outlast the medal. A few hours in public can follow someone for years, because every later dispute gets framed through that earlier spectacle, turning a single day into a permanent label. So the brank shows how power can outsource harm to neighbors. Crowd policing is cheaper than guards. Once people feel allowed to mock someone restrained, cruelty spreads fast. Keep that in mind, because some devices aim to leave lasting marks on the body itself. If scars can act like records, what do they reveal? Let's move to number 12, cat's paw. Exhibit guides describe the cat's paw, often called the Spanish tickler, as a tool designed to tear flesh when dragged across the body. It looks like curved iron claws on a handle. The goal is slow healing, because ripped patches leave uneven scars that stay visible. If scars can speak, what do they say? Some 19th century texts claim it targeted women's breasts or thighs, but stronger evidence places it more broadly, used on many prisoners when authorities wanted ugly wounds that healed slowly. Broad use matters because it shows control, not just gender categories. The animal claw design also strips dignity, making punishment feel like a wild attack rather than a human sentence. Trauma doctors treating torture survivors describe scars as silent records. Patterns can help investigators infer methods later, which matters in asylum cases where victims must prove abuse. Claw tools can leave parallel lines and torn gaps, different from blunt bruising. When paperwork disappears, the body can become the only file left. So the cat's paw shows harm designed to last beyond the session. Lasting marks keep fear alive in everyday life. When damage stays visible, it can change how others treat you for years. Some punishments aimed less at scars and more at turning conflict into a public show. What happens when your body becomes entertainment for strangers? Here comes number 11. Shrew's fiddle. Wikipedia links the Shrew's fiddle, also called the neck violin, to parts of Germany and Austria, used to punish people caught bickering or fighting. It clamps the neck and locks wrists in front of the face. Public display is the point. You can breathe, but you cannot relax, and everyone can see it. Some versions had a bell, so jeers begin before you even arrive. A double fiddle could lock two people together face to face until they settled their fight. That is a clever trap, because anger rises while strangers watch. The device turns a private dispute into theater, and the crowd becomes the pressure that forces peace, whether fair or not. Scholar Una McElvenna writes public penalties could be terrifying and a quasi-religious experience that shaped community emotion. That quote helps explain the design. It stages a lesson the town feels together. The clamp hurts, but the bigger hit is social, since everyone remembers your face and associates it with shame afterward. So the fiddle punishes wrists and reputation at once. Crowd memory keeps it working long after release. When shame becomes a ritual, it trains everyone to police each other. Some communities pushed this further by linking punishment with dirt and disgust, so the label sticks faster. What does that do to someone's life years later? Let's move to number 10. Cucking stool. Wikipedia explains the cucking stool name comes from an old verb meaning to defecate. That detail signals intent. Attach disgust to the target before anything happens. It served as a stool of repentance, used on women labeled scolds, sex workers, or mothers of illegitimate children. Why build punishment around dirt rather than evidence? A woman could be tied to the seat, bare head and feet exposed, left at her door, placed in the market, or dragged through town. Root choice decided who saw her. A 17th-century ballad titled The Cucking of a Scold describes crowds laughing as she passes. The laughter fuels the label because it spreads faster than court minutes. Historians of public shaming note reputation damage can hurt more than physical pain, and some people chose suicide rather than live with the label afterward. That shows the trade-off. The chair lasts hours, but the stigma can last years. For women, stigma could mean lost work, broken marriage chances, and danger at home. So the cucking stool shows shame as a system. Stigma lasts longer than bruises. When a crowd learns to mock a restrained person, cruelty becomes normal. Keep that thought, because some devices sit in a messier evidence zone. Vivid stories, thin archives, fierce debate. When sources clash, how do you decide what to believe? Here comes number 9. Judas cradle. Researchers say archival proof for routine use of the Judas cradle is thin, and many detailed descriptions come from 19th-century collections rather than trial records. The common image shows a frame with a sharp pyramid seat, lowering a victim slowly. Fame is not evidence. So what belongs in confirmed and what belongs in claimed? Thin proof does not mean the idea never existed. It means paperwork is weak. Source limits matter because museum captions can sound confident while relying on later drawings. The image still reflects a known logic. Turn the body into leverage until words come out. When confession is required for conviction, pain becomes a shortcut. One study of historical torture notes many methods aimed to cause severe internal damage while leaving minimal external marks. That quote explains why this story persists, because it matches a wider pattern. If a court wants confession without obvious bruises, methods that hide injury help officials deny harm later, and that denial protects the system. So hold two thoughts. Cruelty happened, and later storytelling can sharpen it for display. Evidence discipline keeps you honest. When a device's proof is debated, ask who benefits from certainty. Some punishments have clearer paper trails because they happened in public squares. Once crowds are involved, humiliation can turn into physical abuse fast. How far did it go? Let's move to number 8, pillory. Ask historians note time in the pillory could last from 1 hour to 3 days, and that range changes everything. The device locks heads and hands on boards in a public square. Wikipedia calls it punishment by public humiliation and often physical abuse. With hours or days available, what do crowds do once they feel permitted? Both men and women faced pillories, yet women often carried extra public marks: cut hair, painted signs, torn clothes. Gender marking matters because it can invite extra aggression. Once you look labeled, strangers may throw, spit, shout, or grab. The state sets the stage, then the crowd adds unpredictable violence, and the victim has nowhere to hide. In 18th century London, brothel keeper Elizabeth Needham stood in the pillory and suffered such harsh treatment that she died soon after, according to reference accounts. That case proves public humiliation can become deadly. When a punishment invites strangers to participate, outcomes depend on the crowd's mood, not only the court's sentence. So the pillory is a lesson about permission, not just wood. Permission signals can unleash harm that goes beyond law. When a system wants tighter control, it can choose methods that restrict movement and noise, yet still end life. Quiet can feel colder than chaos. If the crowd leans in during silence, what does that say about power? Next one is number 7, garrote. Encyclopedia Britannica notes the garrote was used in Spain and some colonies into the 19th and 20th centuries. It used a metal collar around the neck, fixed to a post, tightened by a screw or lever until the windpipe or spine failed. That timeline matters, because it shows a method that persisted into modern state power. Legal historians describe it as a more controlled public death than hanging, because the person stayed seated and movements were smaller. State control shaped the spectacle: less swinging, less chaos, more ownership of timing. Women convicted of treason or serious murder could face it when authorities wanted visibility without messy motion, keeping the body contained and the crowd focused. A 19th century observer described the garrote as horrible because it is quiet. Quiet matters because silence pulls attention closer. The crowd leans in, watching a calm body stop moving. A method designed to look orderly can still be brutal, and the calm surface can make violence feel colder because it looks like procedure rather than rage. So the garrote shows how punishment can be neat and final. Quiet spectacle is still spectacle. When a state chooses control over compassion, it can shape even the last breath into a lesson. Now ask this: what tools rely on posture, fatigue, and slow pressure, breaking people without dramatic wounds that stand out? Let's move to number 6, heretic's fork. Torture catalogs describe the heretic's fork as a small metal bar with 2 prongs, strapped so one end sits under the chin and the other presses into the upper chest. Many surviving forks come from later collections, so firm courtroom proof is often limited. Evidence gaps matter, yet the design still reveals intent. If the victim's head drops, both sets of points dig in, making rest painful. That means the fork punishes sleep, nodding, and even silence. Sleep loss changes behavior fast because exhaustion lowers resistance and makes people agree just to stop pain. The tool turns time into pressure without needing a large machine or visible blood. A 2018 forensic paper on torture methods notes many tools aim to break psychologically without leaving dramatic, visible injuries. That quote fits the fork's logic. Officials can claim minimal harm, while the victim feels constant threat. If marks are small, denial becomes easier, and victims can struggle to prove what happened later. So the fork shows tiny control can be relentless. A tiny tool can run a whole night. When proof of a specific artifact is debated, demand inventories, dates, and records instead of stories. Still, the pattern is clear. Systems often prefer methods that extract words quietly. What happens when punishment shifts from private pressure to public destruction with crowds watching? Here comes number 5. Breaking wheel. Wikipedia describes the breaking wheel as a public execution method used across Europe until the 1800s, with the last known case in Prussia in 1841. Victims were tied down while an executioner broke bones with the wheel itself or an iron bar. Public timing mattered because the slow sequence turned death into a lesson for everyone watching. Women convicted of heinous crimes could be sentenced to the wheel in some regions, even if burning and hanging were more common. Accounts describe limbs crushed in a set order, then the body woven through spokes and raised. That display could continue afterward, extending the warning beyond the moment. When fear is the goal, time becomes part of the weapon. A historian wrote the wheel turned execution into a slow, public dismantling of the person. That quote explains the function: enforce social order through spectacle. The crowd sees the cost of crossing authority. Families see it too. The message travels through memory, gossip, and daily life, shaping behavior long after the execution ends. So the wheel shows punishment as theater. The theater of law can be lethal. When deterrence becomes the priority, efficiency becomes secondary. Ask yourself what it does to a community when death becomes a public event people gather for. If fear is the message, what interrogation tools were used earlier to manufacture truth before sentencing? Next one is number 4. The boot. Wikipedia describes the boot as leg-crushing devices used in parts of Europe, including Scottish and French contexts, where frames surrounded the legs and wedges were driven in until bones cracked. Wedge pressure rises step by step, which makes it useful for interrogation. Officials could pause, tighten, pause again, chasing words before any verdict is reached. In China, an ankle crusher called the jiagun used 3 boards and cords, and a proverb asks, "Under the 3-bar torture, what evidence may you not obtain?" That line admits the purpose. Pain can manufacture answers. Legal historians note many courts required confession to secure a conviction, creating pressure to treat torture as a shortcut to truth, even when it was false. For women, crushing legs carried a long tail. The same legs used for farming, walking to market, carrying water, and caregiving could become permanent sources of pain. Work loss becomes part of the punishment because reduced mobility limits income and independence. The tool hurts the present and steals the future, even after release. So the boot shows confession culture in action. Confession pressure can warp justice. If a proverb celebrates how much evidence pain can produce, it tells you truth was not the priority. Now think about objects with ordinary origins that later get rebranded as torture for display. When does a kitchen tool become a prison story? Let's move to number 3. Flesh hook. Wikipedia notes archaeologists use flesh hook for long-handled iron tools with prongs, likely used to pull meat from large cauldrons during Bronze and Iron Age feasts. One museum note calls it a pronged iron hook used in cookery. That origin matters because it shows how an everyday object can be reinterpreted when later audiences want darker stories. Medieval art and later sermons show demons using triple-pronged hooks to drag souls or tear bodies in hell. Over time, that hell image slid into Inquisition displays, where hooks on chains or walls are presented as devices for hanging prisoners by arms, ribs, or skin. Image drift matters because the object type can be real, while the claimed use for a specific piece can remain unproven. Even if many hooks started in kitchens, the symbol still hits hard. Tools for food become images of humans treated like meat. That shift shapes how cruelty is imagined and sold. The hook becomes a bridge from daily life to horror, and that bridge stays powerful even when documentation is uncertain. So the flesh hook teaches you to track provenance. Provenance matters more than vibe. When you see iron on a wall, ask what the earliest record says it was for, and whether the torture story appears centuries later. If stories can move objects into darker roles, what else can be rebranded with a new label?
Next one is number 2, the scorpion whip. A 19th century classical dictionary explains a scourge could be knotted with bones or heavy indented circles of bronze, and then it was called a scorpion. That is a construction detail, not only a metaphor. The sting comes from what is built into the cords. Each strike can tear deeper than a plain whip, raising injury and infection risk over time. The Bible preserves the threat. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. Threat escalation is the point. When rulers use that language, cruelty becomes policy speech. Promising pain can always increase. For people at the bottom, that message limits resistance before any whip is raised, because the system advertises that it can always get worse. Modern medical reviews of flogging describe deep tissue damage, infection risk, and long-term nerve pain from repeated whipping. Nerve pain can linger for years, affecting sleep, movement, and work. Scars also become social markers, changing how others treat victims afterward. Punishment can extend far beyond the moment of impact. So the scorpion whip shows how a name can hide engineering. Built-in bite is the mechanism. When an authority chooses a tool designed for lasting damage, the goal often extends beyond the session. Obedience through long memory. Now ask this. If a method targets movement itself, not the back or arms, why would officials prefer that? And the last is number 1, the bastinado. Wikipedia notes bastinado appears clearly in European records in 1537 and in China in 960, and it likely has older roots. Bastinado means beating the soles of bare feet with rods, cords, or lashes. Foot targeting sounds minor until you remember soles are packed with nerves, so pain spikes fast and walking becomes torture. Unlike many methods, bastinado stayed common into the 20th century, used in prisons and police stations across regions. That longevity suggests practicality for interrogators. It can disable movement while leaving fewer obvious marks on the torso. Torture research reports victims often keep chronic pain and dark patches on the soles years later, marks that can support abuse claims in asylum cases. A former prisoner in Jordan told reporters after days of bastinado he could not bear it any longer, adding even an animal would not endure it. That quote captures the goal. Reduce a person's sense of self. When every step hurts, work, escape, and even daily chores shrink into fear, and the mind starts bargaining. So bastinado targets your future, not only your body. Step control is the strategy. If pain follows you into every walk, punishment keeps happening in your head each time you move. Sit with that for a second.
If someone can control where you go by controlling your feet, what else can they control without building a prison at all? All right, that's the countdown, and your brain should feel a little suspicious now. If you want the full truth behind more dark history myths, tap the next video on screen.